Welcome, everyone, to the 30-minute Midas touch from beautiful Dyersburg, Tennessee at the Herb Welsh WrestlePlex. Now, here is, pound for pound and inch for inch, the best of the best in professional wrestling today. A wrestling genius worth his weight in gold. The Golden Boy, Greg Anthony.
Welcome, everybody, to the third episode of the 30-minute Midas Touch. I am your host, the Golden Boy, Greg Anthony. I hope you guys enjoyed that humble entrance of mine that is brand new, courtesy of a close friend. And with me, as always, is my co-host, the mighty Manotar himself, Mark Tipton.
Hello. It's certainly a pleasure to be with you again this week. But I do want to take a moment before we get into the subject of this podcast. I would like to take a moment and note the passing of a wrestling legend, and I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that. This week, professional wrestling lost one Pat Patterson.
Yeah, absolutely. Pat Patterson, we're never really going to know the extent of Pat's influence on professional wrestling, but he was one of the greatest minds of professional wrestling. He was probably the greatest finish guy in wrestling history, and just for decades in WWE, he's kind of honed that style and honed the way they did things, and it's truly going to be a loss to the wrestling world because when someone passes away like that, all that knowledge is lost. So it's a sad blow for professional wrestling. We wish Pat and all of his friends all the best.
Well, I appreciate you mentioning his backstage influence in particular. For the viewer, Pat obviously had an in-ring career as the first Intercontinental Champion. Younger fans know him during the Attitude Era as the teaming with Briscoe and their on-screen role with Vince McMahon. But really, that backstage role was tremendous. Its impact on WWE and professional wrestling in general, and having you reference that, I thought was very fitting.
Absolutely. I mean, another thing was, Pat was also a tag team with, the crippler Ray Stevens, and they were a very underrated tag team. A lot of people, when we talk about the greatest tag team of all time, Rock and Roll Express, Midnight Express, they belong in the conversation with that too. They were very ahead of their time. They were amazing, especially in the California area, Cow Palace and things like that. So, once again, we want to wish Pat and all of his family, rest in peace, Pat.
Absolutely. And there's no gracious way to transition away from something as serious as the loss of a life in Pat Patterson. But the subject that we want to address in this week's podcast is a wrestling organization that has made a lot of headlines this week. They are the talk of many people right now, and that is All Elite Wrestling.
Yeah, I mean, I think most people that know me or know my thought process in professional wrestling are probably going to have a pretty good idea of what I think about AEW. But I just want to make clear from the beginning that, I wanted AEW to succeed like anyone else did. AEW, obviously we're not getting the professional wrestling that we want out of WWE, and when AEW started coming along, it was, well, maybe we're going to get it out of this. Maybe this one has an opportunity to give us the old school professional wrestling that we all know and love, but alas, they didn't. They had a huge opportunity, and I think they've squandered it, and they've blown their opportunity, and they've chosen to go a very silly route with some of their decision making and things of that nature. So I'm really not a fan of AEW, but we're going to cover several topics about AEW in this episode so we can kind of break down the hows and the whys.
Well, I suppose if we want to look at the overall direction of AEW and where they're going and the way they present their product, we have to look at the leadership. Now, as many know, there are in effect four leaders there. We have the Young Bucks, the Jackson brothers. We have Kenny Omega, and of course we have Cody Rhodes.
Yeah, I mean, all those guys, you would think Cody Rhodes would be the voice of reason in that scenario, but he's really not. He's kind of went with the flow in all of it too. And they've all got the kind of this same mentality of, professional wrestling's changed. Good versus bad is passe. You can do anything you want to do and be anything you want to be, and everyone's okay and everything's great. And I just don't believe any of that. I believe that professional wrestling needs to be presented in a certain light, and I think good and evil still works, and realism still works, and I think that they've gone in the direction of, well, we're just going to make a television show, and I'm not a fan of, we should have said this about WWE too, but it's the difference between being wrestling on television and a television show about wrestling.
I suppose one thing to mention about that is you mentioned you would think Cody would be the counterbalance. Obviously, Cody Rhodes is someone who literally grew up in the business, and his viewpoint you would think would differ greatly from that of the Young Bucks and Kenny Omega. Would you like to speak a little bit on Cody Rhodes?
Yeah, I lost a lot of respect for Cody Rhodes when he took the dick flip from Joey Ryan. Him, McFoley, and so many other guys had an opportunity to really stand up for professional wrestling by just saying no, but instead they choose to, take the money and run, take the payoff, and not worry about the consequences. So that kind of mentality is kind of the norm now. It's like, well, just do it. What does it matter? No one believes what we're doing anymore anyway, so why try to make them believe? And you know me a lot of years, and you know that that's not my mentality at all. My mentality is, let's make them believe. Let's make them believe in everything we're doing. And I think that professional wrestling backs me up on that, because if you look at professional wrestling as a whole, the biggest stories in professional wrestling aren't of this person turned heel or this happened on the show or whatever. It's the real life stuff that gets talked about the most. So imagine if we try to make them believe everything we did, instead of just the real life stuff. Becky Lynch getting her face broke, Leo Rush being a jackass. All those kind of things were some of the biggest stories in professional wrestling because people believe them. So my theory is, if we just make them believe everything from the beginning, then everything else gets upticked too.
Well, as we look at this, the question that comes to my mind is, do you feel that the Bucks and Omega in particular, and to a lesser extent Cody, do you think that almost the direction they're taking this is they are presenting their show as in a way that would entertain themselves or each other more so than having the viewing audience in mind?
Yeah, that's a great point. Like I said, we've all us wrestlers, on the car, on the way to a show, we'll say, hey, wouldn't it be funny if we did this? Wouldn't it be hilarious if we did this? And it's really just jokes for us, like inside jokes for us. We would never actually do them, But over the last 10, 15 years, guys actually just started doing those things in front of live crowds and like diminishing our business to the point to where no one takes it seriously anymore. And that kind of stuff has greatly hurt our overall product. Like Kenny Omega tried to make the snide comment when they were going to go head-to-head with NXT was, we're not developmental talent. Trying to take a shot at them being NXT being developmental. But now they're both fighting over the same 700,000 people, as to where the Monday Night Wars drew upwards of 8, 9, 10 million people. So who does it actually make look worse? I think Kenny Omega makes him look worse because he basically said those guys weren't on his level, and it turns out not only are they on his level, but in most cases they beat him at his level. So it didn't work for anyone all the way around.
Well, one thing I would think is when you have the direction they have from their leadership, I would like to see what you think about the impact that has on the younger talent that they bring along. I think about the Jurassic Express, Orange Cassidy, the Best Friends, Darby Allin, etc. And I'd like to see your assessment of them and what you see in their performances.
Yeah, it's kind of that same thing. Like, instead of let's produce professional wrestling, it's become this goofball, sketch show. Like Jurassic Express, for instance. We all know the knocks against Marco Stunt. Okay, so I don't really necessarily have to get into that, and we don't have to get into the stuff that he did with Effie, and the gay show that they did and things like that. We don't have to get into that part of it. But let's just look at the Jurassic Express as a whole. Like, I like I like Jack, right? I think that he's really good. Luchasaurus. Now get this. Luchasaurus was on Big Brother. Am I right? He was on Big Brother, and like that's a huge show, and I'm sure it had millions and millions of followers. So let's take the one guy that could possibly give us mainstream media attention, and let's put him in a mask. You know what I mean? I understand that he says that he feels more comfortable in the mask, and this gimmick works for him, stuff like that. But there has to be, as you said earlier, a counterbalance. There has to be a what is best for him or what's best for the company. I think what's best for the company would be for him to be unmasked and possibly gain some of that viewership that they had from Big Brother. I'm not a fan of Chuck Taylor. I think he's goofy and just goofy for the sake of being goofy. But I love Trent Beretta. I think Trent Beretta is an excellent talent and could, be a Shawn Michaels-esque kind of thing. But you have to get away from all the goofy, phony, let's make fun of the business every second we're on television kind of thing.
Well, the next thing that springs to mind is we were talking about counterbalances to this presentation of professional wrestling. And one thing that I would think would do so is their involvement of veteran wrestlers. I'm thinking about on their programs, I see Arn Anderson, I see Tully Blanchard, I've seen Jake the Snake Roberts. Jerry Lynn is there serving in some coaching role or trainer or something of that nature. And you have all these influences with tremendous experience, and you would think they might shape the show we see.
Yeah, I wish that was the case, but it really just seems like they're there just to collect a check. You know what I mean? Like, to me, it diminishes them. Like, I hate to see Arn Anderson in the corner, or Tully Blanchard in the corner, or Jake in the corner, and all this kind of goofy stuff is going on. Because to me, it diminishes who they are and what they've built over their careers. But at the same time, you look at it, and they're on the back nine. You understand? They're on the downside of their careers, and I'm sure they're just looking to get a little bit of that Tony Khan money before they retire and get out for good. And I completely understand that too, but like there has to be some kind of pride in professional wrestling as far as I've worked this long, I've worked this hard, can we at least make it serious? Can we at least take our profession seriously? Let's forget about yourselves, for instance. How about your profession? How about the fact that you grew up a professional wrestling fan and that's what you want to do, but now you're doing all this other stuff?
Well, another thing that came to mind as you were talking on that is I look in the ring and I see Chris Jericho there as a part of AEW serving as their former world champion. And he has tremendous experience, all the way from, well, he spent time in Smoky Mountain, but WCW, WWE, a little time in ECW, all that experience he had. Do you think he, as a leader, in a leadership role there with the Inner Circle, etc., how would you view his contribution to AEW?
Well, and I'm disappointed in Jericho as well. I mean, here's a guy that, when he left WWE and went to New Japan, it was really exciting, because I don't think we ever thought we would see him outside of WWE ever again. But he went to Japan and he worked with Omega, who I said, they're this very new school, old school doesn't work, no one wants to see that anymore kind of mentality. And he goes in there, he sneak attacks him from behind, he gets color on him, he attacks an announcer. They basically went Memphis in Japan, and it worked. Everybody in the wrestling world was talking about it. And then they go to the match in Japan, and Jericho was able to take all the athletic, amazing stuff that Kenny Omega can do and put it within the confines of an actual professional wrestling match instead of a video game contest like they usually have. And to me, it was the best Kenny Omega match that I had seen at that point. So, but then we get to, AEW, and then, most recently, him and MJF are doing some Broadway musical skit, and it's so disappointing to see someone that you looked up to and someone that you thought had the betterment of professional wrestling in mind, just give in and basically say whatever, oh yeah, we're all goofy and silly too. And, that stuff is not going to help anyone involved.
When, you mentioned the MJF and Chris Jericho segment, and one question that I would like to see how you feel about is, do you think that Chris Jericho's time as a part of WWE might have influenced that kind of display. That to me looked like a very sports entertainment kind of vignette or segment.
Yeah, I mean, like I said before, when you inch further and further away from professional wrestling, the core beliefs and the core things that we do, then, the further away you get, the harder it is to get back. And, we talked about the vignettes where the camera was 3 feet away, and all of a sudden that became commonplace. And then we just keep getting further and further away from it. So the more that we allow to exist in our universe, the more of this kind of stuff we're going to get. So yeah, I think that was obviously a huge influence, but you got to think too, AEW told us in the beginning that they were going to be very sports centric, that they were not going to do this kind of stuff. And not only are they doing it, but they're doing it 10 times worse than WWE would do it. I mean, that was even worse than most things I've seen on WWE. And MJF, I was a fan of MJF. I liked 85% of what MJF did. I didn't like all the cussing that he did. There was times that he unrealistically oversold things. Like one time I saw him take a Goldust, gave him a buckle in the corn, and he took a moonsault backflip out of it. Stuff like that. And then his facials, he does the heel facials like old school stuff, but he does it so over the top that it's almost comical. But everyone thinks he's the greatest heel in professional wrestling because no one else does anything near that anymore. So the fact that he's doing it almost incorrectly doesn't matter. I'm just really disappointed as a whole in guys that could really make people that have the ability to change professional wrestling or in those spots to change professional wrestling for the better, and they choose to just line their pockets instead of helping out the business that helped them.
Well, I suppose you're talking about a dichotomy, to use a 10-cent word or dollar word. At one point, every time the performers come to the ring, you see a win-loss record posted around their name, above or below their name. And someone shows this guy's won X number of matches in a row. This is why he is getting an upcoming title shot. And then you compare that to some of the antics that you see. Is that a good synopsis?
Yeah, AEW is, I've said this before too, AEW sometimes is like you're watching Schindler's List, right? And then all of a sudden, Jim Carrey and Jeff Daniels come in as their Dumb and Dumber character. And you're wondering where the hell did that come from? Because it doesn't fit at all, right? So AEW has a lot of identity crisis stuff like that going on. Like they do something that you think works and then they do something completely asinine right behind it. Now, the win-loss record stuff, like I said, they said they were going to be sports-centric. And, for the most part, they're not. But for some reason, they decided to keep the win-loss records. If you know anything about professional wrestling, I said before, some things work in professional wrestling that don't work anywhere else and vice versa. Well, records don't work in professional wrestling because I could be 0-7, but I was cost 7 of those matches by this dirty, dastardly heel that cost me all those matches. And that story's not being told in 0-7. You understand? So you don't get the full picture with an 0-7. As to where in actual sports, with NFL and NBA and things like that, when you're 0-7, you're just 0-7. There's no way around it, right? But for us, we're trying to tell a story. We're trying to tell the hows and the whys. So it doesn't compute the same way that it would with anything else. So basically, what they did was the one thing that doesn't work in professional wrestling with being sports-centric is what they kept, and they kind of ditched the rest of it, which was a huge mistake too.
I would like to bring up a subject that appeals to me just as a viewer and a fan, and that is this week on the Winter is Coming edition of AEW Dynamite, we saw the debut of the man they call Sting.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Sting is, the biggest star in AEW now, for sure. He's one of the biggest stars in professional wrestling history. So it all comes down to what are they going to do with him? You know what I mean? If they bring in one of the biggest stars in wrestling, in Sting, one of the most He's still a household name in most cases. If they bring him in and all they do is sit him in the corner of Darby Allin for the next 2 years, I'm going to be highly disappointed. He needs to have a better role. I think if you put him in the corner with Darby, is basically you're going to dwarf Darby, and you don't want to dwarf Darby any more than he's already dwarfed because he's already 5'0" anyway, right? So to me, I think Sting should have a role where he's trying to save the company. Anytime there's any kind of injustice going on, he's there to set things right. Maybe he says that he sees AEW and it reminds him a lot of WCW. He sees it like his former home used to be, and WCW is no longer with us because of these mistakes being made, and he's here to right all those wrongs and make sure AEW is around for all the fans that love professional wrestling. If he had some kind of role with that where he came back sporadically and was able to do those kind of things, I think that's an interesting role. But for him to have the same role that Arn has or Tully has or anything like that, and to like I said, to pair him with Darby, I think would be a huge letdown to myself and a lot of other fans.
Well, that interests me a great deal. One of the things that I have to keep realistically in mind, as much as I enjoy watching Sting, I have to know he, at this point in his career, having him in the ring is something that's not something that can happen to a great extent. And so I'm interested in your idea. One of the things I remember fondly of Sting is the time he spent in the rafters during WCW. Is that the kind of direction that you think AEW should go with Sting?
Yeah, absolutely. I believe Sting was actually injured. He was the hottest thing in professional wrestling in '97. There's very few people that can say things like that too, that they were the absolute 100% hottest thing in wrestling at one time. And during that '97 run, I think he was injured, and they found a creative way to keep him involved in the story. They kept to keep him on television, and the whole Hogan being the leader of the NWO, and he was chasing him, that kind of thing. It was a very, very good time, and I think that's something that they could revisit, and it would be believable. If he's just lingering out and making sure everything in AEW is going smoothly. If Jericho is in the Hogan role nowadays and he's the guy stirring the pot, maybe he's making sure that Jericho does all things right. So that kind of role would definitely be, I think, the best direction for what they'd want to accomplish.
All right, if I could, I would like to kind of discuss perhaps a step away from the ring as far as AEW and the program they produce, and I would like to go to the announcer table. We've talked about experienced voices, and when I look at the AEW announce position, I see Jim Ross, I see Tony Schiavone, and how would you assess their input and their effect on the AEW program?
Well, I mean, the announcers are such a huge part of your product. People don't understand that. When Stone Cold Steve Austin and The Rock were the hottest things in professional wrestling, and they were going with the Attitude Era and things like that. Yeah, The Rock and Austin were hot, but they were only on the program for 15 or 20 minutes apiece. But Jim Ross and Jerry Lawler, you either heard them or saw them for 2 hours straight. And so in the essence, those guys are the face of your company because they're going to be the ones interacting with your fans the most. Jim Ross has tried the best he can to be the Walter Cronkite, I have all this credibility in the world kind of figure for AEW, but they do so many goofy things, it just puts him in such a bad position a lot of times. Like, I don't know if you remember, they have this space lady. I don't even know what her name is, but basically what it is she's an alien. I mean, legitimately, they're trying to put her over as a actual alien. And like Excalibur, the commentator who wears a mask for some odd reason, starts going into this, her backstory, like, oh yeah, she's from this planet, and it's this, and it's that. And Jim Ross at one point just goes, okay, stop. You know what I mean? Because it doesn't make any sense within the confines of professional wrestling. Wrestling is always going to be, up until COVID-19, wrestling's going to be a spectator sport. You know what I mean? So people need to believe what they're seeing right in front of them in most cases. So I don't see what's wrong with saying, she's not an alien, but you know what? She thinks she's an alien. You know what I mean? Her mindset is that she thinks she's from the planet whatever. And you could put it off like she's just, she's nuts. That's believable because we've all met someone in our lives that was just, nuts, unfortunately. So, and that's the difference between television writing and wrestling booking. And to me, what we need more of nowadays is pro wrestling bookers and not television writers.
All right. One other thing that comes to mind when I think about Away from the Ring, and that is the leadership role. In there, we have a very public role being taken by Tony Khan as the owner, or along with his father, I believe, the owner of AEW, and he is taking a very public role. Do you believe he has the ability to guide the ship and kind of make AEW a cohesive product?
No, I really don't. And you know what? I got blocked by the Young Bucks on Twitter, a year or so ago when AEW started because they got into it with Cornette and they called him he's just a big carny, trying to say that he was, basically a shady promoter or a shady businessman or whatever it is. And I tagged him on Twitter and I said, I think that's pretty hypocritical for you to call Cornette a carny when you guys are milking the biggest money mark in wrestling history. And that's what Tony Khan is. He is a money mark, period. As the story goes, that he actually had meetings with Cornette about being a part of AEW in the beginning. But when Cornette realized that he was going to be in business with Omega and the Bucks and all this kind of stuff, that he knew what direction it was going. So Tony is just living in a fantasy world. You know what I mean? They are the only company that actually benefited from the pandemic. You understand? When you start a wrestling company, first thing, if you're going to do television, you normally just pick one spot to do your television from. You do the tapings, and then once you've established your television, it usually takes, 12 weeks, 16 weeks, somewhere in there. Then you kind of decide where, if you want to travel, you want to do house shows or whatever, you kind of realize where you're going to travel. Well, AEW decides, we're going to travel right from the beginning. And they try to sell out all these big venues for their television. And what happened was, they were barely selling them half out. So they were losing money hand over fist. So then the pandemic hits, and they have to pull back, and they have to take from one location. And then I remember reading where Tony Khan said, this is the first month we actually turned a profit. You know what I mean? It's no shit, Sherlock, because you skip one of the most important steps of running a wrestling company. So, I don't think that he has the business acumen, especially in professional wrestling, to get to that point. I don't want to see anyone lose a job or anything like that, but I feel like overall they are hurting professional wrestling. And, I'm hoping that his dad will kind of see what's going on and maybe pull the plug on it, in the years to come, because if his dad has any business acumen at all, he'll realize, hey, this thing is just draining money, and there's no, unless we make an overhaul change, I don't see how we can save it.
That's interesting. As you assess Tony Khan, I was contemplating, we have a situation where they have 4 executive vice presidents. We have Cody, we've mentioned Cody, Kenny Omega, and the Young Bucks. And you've mentioned before how there needs to be one leader, one guiding force. Obviously, you don't think Tony Khan is that. Do you think that would negatively affect AEW?
Oh, absolutely. Like I said, you have to have one booker to go, this is the direction we're going, this is the world we're creating, this is what we need to do. What's going on at AEW is they've divvied out the booking. Cody Rhodes does his segment, Omega does his, the Bucks handle the tag division. I think actually Omega's in charge of the women's division too. You understand? They've kind of divvied it up and they kind of do their own thing. That'd be like me, I write the first 3 chapters of a book, then I give it to you to write the next 3 chapters, and then we give it to someone else to write the next 4. You understand? When you're booking a show, it all cohesively has to go together in the same world. You all have to be going pretty much the same direction, and that's one of the booking committee. That's where booking committee things come up too, because in a booking committee, one great idea gets dwindled down to an okay idea. You know what I mean? Because not everyone sees the same vision. So, yeah, there needs to be one guy, one booker, one creative force that says this is the direction we're going. Then he takes inputs from everybody, but ultimately it's his decision.
And, I see time's going short, but I want to say, did you have anything you wanted to wrap up or assessment of the presentation of Sting and his return, or anything else in general about AEW?
Sting, I thought, it was fun to see Sting out there. Like, obviously he went face to face with Cody and Dustin and Arn and Darby, and we're kind of just getting, they didn't give you too much in one night as far as, we're going in a direction, we don't know what direction yet. So we'll have to see where that goes. As far as AEW as a whole, I think that they've just missed a huge opportunity. Like the first night I think they drew almost 2 million people on their first episode, and since that first episode, they've lost 1.3. You understand? I don't see how you can see that as a success. You understand? Like, I understand losing some, but you're losing, 1.5 basically. So I think they really need to, get back to basics. All the things we talked about today. Booking is a huge issue. Also, some of the personnel that they're using. If I took over AEW tomorrow, there'd be at least 10 guys on the chopping block day one, because we have to re-educate the fans on what professional wrestling, the sport of professional wrestling, really is. So, we're never going to be right on 30 minutes. Right now we're at 31 minutes, but I want to thank my co-host, the mighty Manotar himself, Mark Tipton. Thank everybody for joining to this episode of the 30-Minute Midas Touch. I am your host, the Golden Boy, Greg Anthony. Please tune in next time, because it will be as good as